China's foreign minister addresses the Israel-Hamas conflict at the United Nations Security Council. What role can China play in resolving that crisis? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. China holds the rotating presidency of the UN Security Council this month, and on Wednesday it held a high-level meeting on the Palestinian-Israeli issue. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi, who chaired the meeting, and UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres were among several speakers to address the gathering. We begin with this report from correspondent Jody Jacobs.
Wang Yi is presiding over a high-level interministerial session of the Security Council here in New York, the same day the United Nations commemorates the International Day of Solidarity with the people of Palestine. Several foreign ministers from member states have joined Wednesday's meeting to discuss the fighting between Israel and Hamas. Wang Yi says that the world is standing at the crossroads of war and peace, and has called on the international community to take more active steps to save lives and restore peace.
Fairness and justice on the Palestinian question lies in a two-state solution. This is irreplaceable. Only the true and comprehensive implementation of the two-state solution can restore peace to the Middle East, to realize peaceful coexistence between the two states of Palestine and Israel, and achieve common development of the Arabs and Jews. China calls for ramping up international and regional diplomatic efforts, reshaping credible multilateral processes.
The UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has told the Council that while he welcomes the current fragile ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, its full implementation is not enough.
The people of Gaza are in the midst of an epic humanitarian catastrophe before the eyes of the world. We must not look away. Intense negotiations are taking place to prolong the truce, which we strongly welcome. But we believe we need a true humanitarian ceasefire. And we must ensure the people of the region finally have a horizon of hope.
Palestine's foreign minister has called on the Security Council to act decisively before all of Gaza is destroyed. He says the current conflict will not lead to peace.
Isn't it time we found a way to live side by side? We don't even need to search that hard for that way. It is enshrined in international law and the relevant UN resolutions. The fulfillment of the Palestinian people's inalienable rights and two states living side by side in peace and security on the pre-1967 borders.
Israel has again lambasted the United Nations and certain council members of not condemning Hamas, which killed 1,200 people during the October 7th attack. Israel says peace can only be achieved if Hamas is eliminated.
This war can end tomorrow, even today, if Hamas returns all of the hostages and turns in all the terrorists who took part in the massacre. A real ceasefire can be achieved that will last decades. Demand this of Hamas. This is the solution. The time has come for this council to truly focus on its mandate, security.
Several members of the Security Council have welcomed the current truce and humanitarian ceasefire. Many have cautioned that if decisive action isn't taken soon, the fighting will continue and many more lives will be lost. Jody Jacobs, CGTN, New York.
Okay, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Jerusalem is Amotz Asa-El. He is a senior commentator with the Jerusalem Post. With us too is Khalil Jahshan. He is the executive director of the Arab Center here in Washington, D.C. Also joining the discussion is Nabeel Khoury. He is a former U.S. diplomat. And with us from New York is Victor Gar. He is chair professor at Soochow University. Welcome to all of you. Victor, let me start with you. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi, he stressed the importance of, and I'm quoting him here, fairness and justice and going forward working on a two-state solution. Can you give us some perspective on the Chinese view on this crisis in light of what the Foreign Minister had to say at the UN?
Thank you very much. I think the Chinese government attaches great importance to any efforts aimed at achieving lasting peace for Israel as well as for Palestine. And the best solution is to achieve the two-state solution as mandated by the United Nations resolutions. And the fact that this two-state solution has not been achieved is due to very much to the resistance on the part of the Israeli government, aided, abetted by, to a very large extent, by the U.S. government. And China believes this is the root cause for instability and lots of turmoil involving Israel and Palestine. Therefore, I think China is adopting a very overarching macro view about the need and the absolute necessity to achieve lasting peace, because otherwise Israel and Palestine will be engulfed in this seesaw of violence after violence, and eventually everyone will be a loser. The fact that Mr. Wang Yi is chairing this senior meeting at the United Nations Security Council in the month of November, when China is serving as the rotating chairman of the Security Council meeting, serves to indicate China's commitment to urging every party to move in the right direction to achieve lasting peace, rather than, for example, smaller steps in one way or another which benefit Israel versus Palestine or vice versa.
Victor, you say Israel and the United States is responsible for the situation that we find ourselves in right now. What about the Palestinians? Who does Israel negotiate with? The Palestinians are divided right now. Hamas in Gaza, the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank.
First of all, Hamas does not represent the totality of the Palestinian people. And there is some problem with the Palestinian Authority over the past several years. Therefore, I think to really achieve a final solution leading towards lasting peace, we'll need to really sift over the situation involving the Palestinians and eventually find out the best representative for the Palestinian people. It's a painstaking process.
Yeah.
On the Chinese side, China recognizes the Palestinian Authority. Earlier this year, China actually welcomed the president of Palestine on a state visit to China, and the Palestinian president got very high-level treatment and the protocol, and many Palestinian peoples were actually moved to tears to see that their leader got such high-level protocol granted by the Chinese government. So I think it will take all the efforts by many countries in the world to figure out who will be the true representative of the Palestinian people.
Okay. Amotz, in that report at the beginning of the program, we heard from the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations. He was very critical of the UN. In fact, we heard him say in that report that the war can end tomorrow if Hamas returns all the hostages and turns in those responsible for the attack on October 7th. There's increasing pressure on Israel right now for there to be a much longer ceasefire, in fact, that will end the violence. Is it likely that things will change?
To answer your question, I must first address what Victor said. I think that the stance that he voiced in the name of the government of China is actually agreeable to the Israeli majority. People here want the two-state solution. The problem is that, and this I believe China ignores, that Hamas is not merely rivaling the Palestinian Authority, as Victor did concede. The problem is Hamas's motivation. Hamas is motivated by religious fanaticism, and that is what makes Hamas totally disagree with Israel's right to exist and in fact strive towards that end, as it now demonstrated so dramatically. This is the problem. When one understands that this is the problem from the viewpoint of any objective observer, then one understands Israel's resolve now, which really is across the political spectrum, the resolve to fight Hamas and to eradicate it. There is a new Israeli strategy emerging, and it's reflecting the new Israeli consensus, namely that whatever the circumstances, whatever the cost, Israel cannot tolerate anywhere along its borders the presence of a jihadist militia.
Khalil, Jahshan, what is your response to that? You know, we've heard this before, that Hamas does not recognize the right of Israel to exist, and we just heard there from Amotz telling us that Israel is not going to tolerate Hamas along its border.
Well, first, it's true that the traditional position of Hamas, as enshrined in some of their earliest documents, does not recognize the state of Israel, and but this has, you know, changed over the years, not necessarily, you know, in advance of negotiations, but Hamas has, on repeated occasions, including in this crisis, expressed its desire to basically negotiate, to be considered as an equal in this negotiation process. And it's willing to talk with Israel. It's not necessarily willing to accept Zionism and join the movement, but after all, it's a political movement that is anxious to govern in Palestine. All this that has been done by Hamas from late 70s, 78 till today is essentially an attempt to present itself as a serious partner that's willing to deal with the Israelis and with others. It will not recognize Israel in its ideal
Khalil,
form, but it's willing to negotiate that.
Yeah, I just want to get back to the meeting at the Security Council at the UN on Wednesday.
Yes.
Can the UN still play a meaningful role in resolving this?
This is kind of the traditional question, Anand. We've been asking that question since 1945. The UN is equipped and can play a constructive role in all crises around the world if the main member states are willing to support that endeavor. But if they are going to neutralize each other with their own veto power, particularly those who possess that, the UN becomes a debate society. And in this regard, it has become a debate society because those who support Israel blindly throughout the past 75 years have blocked, if you will, any serious attempt to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict and its core issue, the Palestine question. So if there is a will, and there is no kind of blind support for the representative of Israel who made an unfulfillable demand. I mean, we just heard him on your show, basically in the intro, saying that the purpose of his government is the elimination of one party. The UN is not a setting best suited for elimination, or even, as Amotz repeated, for eradicating other people. Israelis are the last people on earth who should be talking about eradications and eliminations. At least they should come up with some better terminology for dealing with their enemies. So I would say yes to your question. The UN can play a constructive role, but that would require some serious effort, particularly on the part of the US that has been hindering that role.
Nabeel Khoury, let's look at the bigger picture here. China is also calling for international and regional efforts to resolve this crisis. I mean, does the region need a new perspective, a new approach on how to resolve this crisis? To be frank, if we look at the efforts that have been made over the past few years, past few decades, really, they've all failed.
That's correct. For decades, the U.S. has taken the lead in mediating and trying to resolve this conflict. But clearly, the U.S. has failed in doing that. A couple of times it came close, but in the end, there was no agreement. And this current administration, I'm afraid, has really ignored the problem. They're talking now about the two-state solution. But for the past 3 years, since they came into the White House, they did not start a serious negotiating process. In fact, the big picture shows that U.S. influence in the Middle East has declined over the past 10 years or so. And so I think the U.S. at least needs a partner, needs some assistance. The United Nations cannot function without the Security Council and the permanent 5 members, to be exact, agreeing on a solution and agreeing to implement it. I think the initiative that China took today at the United Nations was an excellent one, but even a mild resolution like 2712 the U.S. Abstained on that. So I think China, which clearly has started playing a role in mediation in the Middle East, needs to convince Washington to work together. China and the U.S. have been looking for ways to avoid dangerous confrontation between them, the rivalry, and looking for ways to cooperate. I think this is a perfect opportunity, perhaps working behind the scenes, to agree on something that together they could get the United Nations to implement.
Victor Gao, the president of the UN General Assembly, Dennis Francis, he praised China's role at the UN as well and its impact. China, of course, currently holds the chair of the rotating presidency of the Security Council. This is what Dennis Francis had to say. Let's listen.
Well, China is a very active member, and reliably so, of the United Nations. There is only one China in terms of its voice. When China speaks, people listen attentively. And I have to say that the month of its presidency of the Security Council has in fact proven quite successful, not just for China, for the UN, for the international system, and most importantly, for the people of Gaza, because it was under China's leadership of the Council that the Security Council finally was able to agree a resolution after 5 attempts before. So to sum up, one would have to make the assessment that China's leadership has been exemplary.
That was the President of the UN General Assembly, Dennis Francis, talking to my colleague Elaine Reyes. So, Victor, high marks there for China from the President of the UN General Assembly, but there's a lot to be done, isn't it? Where does China go to from here? Clearly, China can't do it by itself. It would have to work with other major players like Israel, like the Palestinians, like the United States. What happens next?
Yes, thank you very much. I think for China's representations in the Security Council of the United Nations, especially for this month, when China serves as the rotating chair, China does bring a lot of decency, dignity, and fairness and equity and lawfulness, for example, to this very important issue involving the Israelis and the Palestinians. And the fact that China has been promoting the two-state resolution, restoring the Palestinian border to 1967, and using Eastern Jerusalem as the capital city for Palestine. I think these are all what really matter for achieving lasting peace for Israel as well as for Palestine. I think going forward, China will continue to urge all parties involved to do something like China is doing. That is, don't have any vested interest in promoting peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis. We really need to be very much focused on promoting this peace for its own stake, because without peace, the Israelis will suffer, the Palestinians will suffer. This wanton killing of the innocent people will continue to the horror of all the people in the world.
Yeah.
So I think China will continue to engage with all the parties involved, especially countries like the United States and all the other permanent member states of the Security Council, to see whether there will be really a real framework for under which the two-state solution will be achieved, bringing lasting peace to Israel as well as Palestine.
Amotz, we have seen several days of a pause in the fighting, in the violence. We've seen hostages being released by Hamas. We've seen Israel release Palestinian prisoners that were held in Israel. But on Wednesday, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Israeli forces will resume bombing on Gaza after the truce. In fact, one of his ministers Itamar Ben-Gvir is even threatening to break up the coalition if the violence does not resume. If we look at what happened so far in almost 8 weeks of bombing, I mean, I take your point earlier on that you said that there is consensus now in Israel to eliminate, to get rid of Hamas. But if you look at what's happened so far, the majority of the people, 15,000 have been killed. The majority of them have been women and children.
First of all, that figure and the ratio of children to adults are unverified and given only by partial sources within Hamas, but never mind right now.
Amotz, those are UN figures.
The analysis of the problem as far as the Israeli consensus is concerned, and unlike China's analysis of the Middle East conflict, in our view, the problem right now is about religion, not about nationalism. And within religion, the problem is in Iran. Iran is unsettling the Middle East. This is the problem, and this is what China refuses to concede because of its own good reasons. It has a very important and sensitive bilateral relationship with Iran, which has become a major oil supplier for the Chinese empire, for Chinese industry, and they're not directly affected by Iran's meddling in the entire Middle East. But this is the problem. This is where the problem lies. And the rest of the world, I think, does understand this. You've seen, for instance, right now, the way the Dutch electorate responded to what is happening here. People in Europe are alarmed by what has just happened here. They certainly are alarmed in the United States. They have yet to become alarmed in China.
Okay, Victor Gao, we just heard there from Amotz telling us that, firstly, I mean, Victor, do you acknowledge that Iran is involved in this and is part of the reason for what is happening in the Middle East right now, A? And B, is it true that China will not be hard on Iran because of the close trade relationship that they have?
First of all, China has excellent relations with Iran as well as with almost all the countries in the Middle East. And the fact that China brokered the peace deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia earlier this year is a firm indication that China is committed to bring about peace between parties which may not be able to talk directly with each other. China is trying its best to do the same between Israel as well as the Palestinians. The fact that China has excellent relations with Iran is a positive factor for eventually achieving peace in the Middle East. Don't underestimate China's ability of building peace if countries like Israel will listen very carefully and patiently to the good advice, moral advice, legal advice that China will bring onto the table.
Okay, I am rapidly running out of time. I want to get to Khalil Jahshan. Khalil Jahshan, what do you make of Amotz's point that Iran is actually part of the reason, part of the root of the problem here?
It might be, but again, that's subject to debate. I mean, if you're talking about religious fanaticism, Iran does not have monopoly on that. On the one hand, Israel is spending all its time, at least before the 7th of October, trying to normalize with Arabs who also have the same probably religious fanaticism that Iran might have. And he is in no position to accuse Iran of religious fanaticism, even though I agree with him about that. But look at his own government, for God's sake. Talking about religious fanaticism, half of the Israeli government, fits under this particular category. So no one has monopoly over that. The problem I have with this conflict right now, it has really, this war has pushed the conflict into a religious conflict based on Israeli beliefs and based on some Palestinian beliefs. And that makes it much more difficult to resolve in the future for those of us who believe in a workable political solution.
Right. Nabeel Khoury, the United States Secretary of State Antony Blinken, he will be flying back to the Middle East. So far, the United States continues to provide massive financial, military, and diplomatic support to Israel, but it is becoming less popular here in the United States. And we see that from domestic political polls which have been taken, which show that support for Biden's Israel policy has been dropping. We've seen that in several polls over the past few weeks, especially, of course, among younger voters. Do you think there's going to be a point where the United States starts putting pressure on Israel?
At this point, it doesn't seem like it. The change in public opinion has definitely happened over the past few years, and particularly the younger generation here is more sympathetic to Palestinians and more critical of Israeli behavior, especially now during this government in Israel, which is an extreme right-wing government. I think the Biden administration going into an election is worried, and the Republicans and Trump in particular are poised to take full advantage of any pressure that Biden puts on Israel, particularly if it's out in the open. I think they might speak harsh words behind closed doors.
Yeah.
But in the end, I think you have to come up with a solution that the permanent five at the UN will agree to. And then together they can convince, cajole, or pressure the Israeli government. On religious fanaticism, I fully agree with Khalil. This Israeli government is full of it. And some of the statements that they are making, individual members, are horrific. And so I think the idea that Hamas is a religious party, yes, it is. It may not be the ideal representative of the Palestinian people, but in the end, it is not the job of Israel, the US, or anybody else to choose the leadership of the Palestinian people for them. If fair and free elections, fine, they can have another go at it. But in the end of the day, you negotiate with people you do not like. You don't negotiate with your friends and allies. So in the end of the day, Hamas is not the main problem. The main problem is occupation, which must end, and the right of Palestinians to self-determination.
Khalil, Jahshan, very quickly, I've only got about 30 seconds. Another development, the WHO is saying that the spread of untreated disease could kill more Palestinians in Gaza than the actual bombings have done. I mean, could this humanitarian crisis get a lot worse?
It could. As a matter of fact, all indications are pointing in that direction. Remember, Gaza has been deemed unlivable this year by the UN even before the 7th of October. So with all this destruction of housing, of displacing 74% of the population to the south, and damaging most of the hospitals, I wouldn't be surprised if disease will become the #1 threat.
Okay, we have to leave it there. Thank you to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.